The storm had been raging for 3 days when Prince Daemon finally reached the gates of Tormel Manor, the ancestral estate of Lord Cassius, the traitor who had been executed at dawn just 5 days prior. The iron gates stood twisted and broken, as if something far more violent than mere neglect had torn them from their hinges. Daemon dismounted his black stallion, his boots sinking into mud that seemed darker than it should be, almost crimsony the flickering light of his torch. The manor loomed before him, a sprawling structure of blackened stone and shattered windows, and as he approached, he could feel the weight of secrets pressing down upon the very air itself. This was no ordinary confiscation of a traitor's property. King Alfa himself had ordered Daemon to come here alone, had looked at him with those cold, calculating eyes and said that what lay within these walls was for Daemon's eyes only, and Daemon had known in that moment that his father was afraid of something, truly afraid, perhaps for the first time in his ruthless reign. The great oak doors were unlocked, swinging up at the barest touch, and Daemon stepped into a trance how draped in shadows so thick they seemed almost solid. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Cassius' ancestors staring down with expressions that ranged from stern disapproval to something that looked uncomfortably like pity. The air smelled of old parchment, dried herbs, and underneath it all, something else, something that made Daemon's skin crawl with primal unease. He had been called the renegade prince for good reason, having spent the last 7 years in exile after refusing to execute his younger sister on King Alfa's orders, and only Morgana's intervention had saved him from sharing his sister's eventual fate. Morgana, the queen, the witch who had bound herself to King Alfa in a marriage that the entire kingdom whispered about in fearful tones. Daemon had not seen his stepmother in those 7 years, but her letters had found him wherever he went, coded messages that spoke of patience, of waiting, of a truth that would eventually come eternite. Now, as he moved through the manor's corridors, his torch casting dancing shadows on walls covered in peeling wallpaper, Daemon wondered if this was the truth Morgana had been preparing him for. Lord Cassius had been one of King Alfa's most trusted advisors, a man who had stood at the king's right hand for 23 years, who had counseled him through wars and famines, through political upheavals and supernatural threats. And then, 3 months ago, Cassius had been arrested on charges of high treason, accused of conspiring with the northern coveys to overthrow the throne. The trial had been swift, the evidence seemingly damning, and Cassius had been beheaded in the courtyard of the castle with King Alfa himself swinging the executioner as a blade. But Daemon had seen something in Cassius's eyes as he knelt at the block, not the fear or defiance one might expect, but something else entirely, something that looked almost like relief. The manor's study was on the 2nd floor, accessible through a narrow staircase that creaked ominously with each step. Daemon pushed open the study door and found himself in a room that had clearly been searched before, papers scattered across the floor, bookshelves emptied, furniture overturned. But King Alfa's men had been looking for evidence of treason, if conspiracy with external enemies. Daemon was looking for something else, though he could not have said exactly what. He set his torch in a wall sconce and began to methodically search the room, running his hands along walls, tapping floorboards, checking for hidden compartments. Each was behind a false panel in the fireplace that he found the first cache, a leather satchel containing 3 journals bound in dark red leather, their pages covered in Cassius's distinctive cramped handwriting. Daemon carried the journals to the desk, cleared a space among the scattered papers, and opened the first one. The date at the top of the first page made his breath catch in his throat. It was from 31 years ago, 6 years before Daemon himself was born, and the first entry was titled simply, "The Day Alfa Lost His Soul." Daemon began to read, and with each line, the foundations of everything he thought he knew about his father began to crumble. Cassius wrote of a young prince, Alfa before he became king, who had been nothing like the cold, ruthless monarch he would become. This Alfa had been idealistic, passionate, determined to reform the kingdom's brutal laws and the persecution of those born with magical abilities. He had fallen in love with a common healer named Elara, a woman gifted with the ability to cure any ailment, and against all protocol and tradition, he had married her in secret, a ceremony witnessed only by Cassius and two other trusted friends. Daemon's hands trembled as he turned the pages. He had never heard of this Elara, had been told his entire life that his mother was Lady Beatrice, a noble woman who had died giving birth to him. But it was Cassius's account, written in meticulous detail, describing how Alfa and Elara had been happy for 6 months, how she had become pregnant, how they had planned to reveal their marriage once the child was born and could not be contested. And then came the entry dated exactly 9 months before Daemon's own birth. In the words written there seemed to burn themselves into Daemon's vision. Elara had gone into labor 3 weeks early, attended only by a midwife Cassius had selected for her discretion. But someone had betrayed them. Lord Malachai, Alfa's uncle and the then regent, had discovered the secret marriage and saw it as an opportunity to maintain his own power. Malachai had sent assassins, not to kill Elara outright, but to ensure that the birth went wrong, that both mother and child would die, leaving Alfa grief-stricken and dependent on Malachai's counsel. But Elara's healing powers had been stronger than anyone anticipated. Even as the poison the midwife had administered began to take effect, Elara had managed to save her son, channeling the last of her life force to protect the infant's body from the toxin. She had died within minutes of the birth, but the child had lived, had been healthy and strong. In his grief and rage, Alfa had done something that would change the course of the kingdom forever. He had Majadion with a witch, a powerful sorceress who lived in the deep forests and was said to have the ability to speak with death itself. That witch had been Morgana. Daemon sat back in the chair, his mind reeling. Morgana had not entered King Alfa's life as a mysterious foreign queen seeking alliance, as the official histories claimed. She had been there from the beginning, had been there on the night of Daemon's birth, and whatever deal Alfa had struck with her had transformed him into the king the realm now feared. The second journal picked up the story from Cassius's perspective as he watched his closest friend become someone he no longer recognized. Morgana had promised Alfa the power to avenge Elara and destroy everyone who had conspired against them, but the price she demanded was steep. Alfa would have to give up his capacity for love, would have to sever the emotional bonds that had made him vulnerable. In return, Morgana would bind herself to him, would become his queen and his weapon, would use her considerable powers to hunt down every person who had played a role in Elara's death. Alfa, drowning in grief and rage, had agreed. The ritual had taken place in the catacombs beneath the castle, with Cassius and 2 others bearing witness. Morgana had drawn a circle of salt and silver, had placed Alfa at its center, and had begun to chant in a language that predated the kingdom itself. Cassius described how the very stones of the castle had seemed to scream, how shadows had poured from the walls like black water, how Alfa had convulsed and bled from his eyes as something fundamental was ripped from his soul. When it was over, Alfa had stood up a changed man. The warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by a calculating coldness that made even his closest friends flinch. Morgana, who had appeared as a young woman of perhaps 25, had suddenly looked older, more solid, more present, as if she had absorbed the very vitality she had taken from Alfa. The purge had begun that night. Malachai was the first to die, found in his chambers with his throat slit and a black hose on his pillow. The midwife who had administered the poison vanished completely, though her screams were reported echoing through the forest for 3 nights straight. One by one, everyone who had known about the plot, everyone who had remained silent, everyone who had benefited from Elara's death, met ends that were swift and brutal. Within 6 months, the court had been completely restructured, With Alfa at its head and Morgana at his side, their marriage announced as a political alliance but whispered about as something far darker. Daemon forced himself to keep reading, though every instinct screamed at him to burn these journals and flee. Cassius had remained loyal, had helped cover up the purge, had even helped fabricate the story of Lady Beatrice being Daemon's mother, a tale woven so thoroughly into court records that it had become accepted truth. But as the years passed, Cassius had begun to regret his complicity. He wrote of watching Daemon grow up under the cold tutelage of a father who seemed incapable of affection, of seeing the boy's natural kindness and idealism slowly crushed under the weight of Alfa's impossible expectations. He wrote of the birth of Daemon's younger sister, Lyanna, whose mother had been an arranged marriage that produced an heir and then ended in a quiet annulment. He wrote of the moment when everything had begun to unravel, 7 years ago, when Alfa had ordered Daemon to execute Lyanna for the crime of helping refugees escape the kingdom's brutal work camps. Daemon remembered the day with crystalline clarity. He had studied the throne room with his sword drawn, his sister kneeling before him with tears streaming down her face, and Alfa sitting on the throne with an expression of absolute expectation. Morgana had been there too, standing in the shadows beside the throne, and when Daemon had dropped his sword and refused the order, it had been Morgana who had spoken first, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. She had told Alfa that killing both his children for the crime of compassion would serve no purpose, that Daemon should be exiled instead, allowed to live but stripped of his title and inheritance. Alfa had agreed with a cold nod, and Daemon had been escorted from the castle that very hour. He had learned later that Lyanna had been executed anyway, 3 days after his departure, on charges of continued conspiracy. He had never forgiven himself for not dying at her side. But now, reading Cassius's account of that day, Daemon learned something that shattered what little certainty he had left. Lyanna had not been executed. She had been taken to Morgana's tower, the black spire on the castle's eastern edge that no one entered without the queen's explicit permission. Cassius had been granted access once, weeks after the supposed execution, and what he had found there had horrified him. Lyanna was alive, but changed, her eyes glowing with an unnatural silver light, her hair having turned pure white overnight. Morgana had performed a ritual on her, had bound her to the same forces that bound the queen herself, had transformed the princess into something that was no longer entirely human. Cassius had demanded to know why, had asked Morgana what purpose this cruelty served, and the queen's answer had been simple and devastating. The ritual that had stripped Alfa of his capacity to love had not been permanent. It was a binding that required constant maintenance, regular reinforcement, and the only way to maintain it was through sacrifice. Morgana needed souls connected to Alfa, people he should have loved, and by transforming them into vessels for dark magic, she could sustain the binding indefinitely. Daemon's vision blurred with rage and grief as the full horror of the revelation crashed over him. His sister was alive but had been turned into a living battery for the curse that bound their father. How many others had there been over the years? How many of Alfa's children, his wives, his friends, had been fed into Morgana's machine to keep the king cold and controllable? Cassius's journal answered that question in excruciating detail. There had been 4 other children, born to different mothers, each one taken when they reached a certain age and transformed in Morgana's tower. There had been 3 of Alfa's brothers, who had supposedly died of various illnesses but had actually been sacrificed to strengthen the binding. And there had been Elare's sister, the aunt Daemon had never known he had, who had come to court demanding answers about her sister's death and had disappeared into the tower, never to be seen again. The 3rd journal was different from the first 2. Where they had been historical accounts, this one was a plan, a detailed conspiracy to break Morgana's hold over Alfa and restore what had been taken from him. Cassius had spent 15 years researching the ritual, consulting with witches and warlocks across the realm, gathering components and knowledge. He had discovered that the binding could be broken, but only through a specific sequence of events. First, Alfa would have to be confronted with the truth of what had been done to him, would have to remember Elara in the love he had felt for her. Second, a blood relative would have to willingly enter Morgana esse tower and free the souls trapped there, breaking the power sources that fed the curse. Third, and most crucially, Morgana herself would have to be forced to reverse the ritual, to take back what she had given and restore Alfa's stolen capacity for emotion. Cassius had been weeks away from attempting this plan when he had been arrested, and Daemon now understood that the charges of treason had been fabricated by Morgana herself, who had discovered the conspiracy and moved swiftly to eliminate the threat. But Cassius had been clever, had known that discovery was always a possibility, and so he had left insurance. Hidden in the back of the Thumb Journal was a map detailing a hidden passage that led from Tornuel Manor directly into the catacombs beneath the castle, the same catacombs where the original ritual had been performed. Beside the map was a keen, old image of black iron and a note in Cassius' handwriting that simply read, "For Prince Daemon, should he prove worthy. The inheritance is not the manor, but the truth. Use it to free your father, or use it to destroy him. The choice must be yours." Daemon stared at the king for a long moment, feeling the weight of it in his palm, feeling the weight of the decision before him. He could take these journals to the Council of Lords, could expose Morgana's manipulation and perhaps rally support to depose both her and Alfa. But such a course would plunge the kingdom into civil war, would see thousands dead in the fighting, and there was no guarantee that whoever emerged victorious would be any better than what they had now. Or he could follow Cassius' plan, could attempt to break the binding and restore his father's humanity. But that course was fraught with its own dangers. If Morgana discovered what he was attempting, she would kill him without hesitation. If the ritual went wrong, it could destroy Alfa entirely, leaving the kingdom without a ruler and vulnerable to the northern coves and other external threats. Even if he succeeded, there was no guarantee that Alfa would thank him for it. The king had lived with the binding for over 30 years. Having his capacity to love suddenly restored might break his mind entirely, leave him a shibboleth crushed under the weight of 3 decades of atrocities committed without the benefit of conscience or remorse. Daemon carefully packed the journals and the key into his saddlebag, then continued his search of the manor. If Cassius had left the journals as insurance, there had to be more, other tools and information that would be necessary for what came next. He found the second cache in Cassius' bedroom, hidden beneath a floorboard under the bed. This one contained a wooden box filled with carefully wrapped components, a vial of silverage water from the sacred springs, a lock of hair that Daemon somehow knew belonged to his mother Elara, 3 black candles marked with runes he could not read, and a dagger with a blade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was also a letter, sealed with Cassius' personal sigil, addressed to Daemon. The priest broke the seal and read words that Cassius had written, knowing he might not live to deliver them himself. The letter confirmed everything the journals had revealed but added one crucial piece of information. Morgana was not acting out of simple cruelty or hunger for power. The ritual that bound Alfa had bound her as well, had tied her life force to his in a way that meant if one died, the other would follow within hours. She had made herself simultaneously indispensable and trapped, unable to leave or release her hold on Alfa without ensuring her own death. But the binding had a weakness, one that Morgana had perhaps not fully understood when she agreed to it. The ritual drew its power from the absence of love in Alfa's heart, fed on the void where his emotions should have been. If that void were filled, if Alfa were somehow made to feel again, the binding would begin to crack, and within it crack, Morgana esse hold would weaken. Cassius had theorized that Daemon himself might be the key. As Alpha esse son, as the child Elara had died protecting, Daemon carried a connection to the king that predated the ritual. If Daemon could find a way to pierce Alpha esse emotional armor, to make him remember not just Elara but what each had felt like to love her, to love anyone, the binding might shatter all at once. Cassius had been working on a counter-ritual, a spell that would force emotional recognition, but he had never completed it. The components in the box were what he had gathered. The letter concluded with instructions on where to find the witch who might be able to finish what Cassius had started. Her name was Selene, and she lived in the Tornude Forest, 3 days high to the north of the manor. She was, according to Cassius, one of the few witches powerful enough to stand against Morgana, and she had her own reasons for wanting to see the binding broken. Daemon memorized the directions, then carefully repacked the box and added it to his saddlebag. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows with a fury that seemed almost personal, and Daemon wondered if Morgana had somehow sensed what he had found, if she was even now reaching out with her powers to stop him before he could move forward. But the manor remained quiet except for the storm, and after one final search that turned up nothing more of significance, Daemon made his way back to the entrance hall. His horse was where he had left it, unbuttered by the weather, and as Daemon prepared to mount, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tracks in the mud, footprints that had not been there when he arrived, leading from the gate toward the road that ran east, back toward the capital. Someone had been there while he was inside, had watched him enter and had chosen not to confront him but to report back instead. Daemon swung into the saddle, urged his horse forward, his mind racing through possibilities. If each was one of Alpha esse agents, then the king would know within hours that Daemon had found something significant. If each was one of Morgana esse's servants, then the queen might already be preparing countermeasures. Either way, Daemon esse's timeline had just collapsed. He could not afford the 3 days each would take to reach Selene esse cottage. He needed to act now, needed to get into the castle and into the catacombs before either Alpha or Morgana could stop him. The hidden passage from Tornuel Manor might be his only chance. He wheeled his horse around and rode back to the manor, not bothering with stealth this time. The entrance to the hidden passage was marked on Cassius' map as being in the wine cellar, behind a rack that had held vintages from the kingdom's founding. Daemon descended into the cellars, finding them flooded with several inches of water from the storm. He located the wine rack easily enough. Each swung aside at the touch of the black iron key, revealing a narrow stone staircase that descended into darkness, so complete that even his torch seemed to barely penetrate it. Daemon took a breath, squared his shoulders, and started though. The passage was old, far older than the manor itself, carved from living rock and supported by arches that bore markings in that same ancient language Morgana had used during the ritual. Water dripped from the ceiling, strange fungi grew in patches along the walls, glowing with a faint bioluminescence that painted everything in shades of sickly green. The passage descended for what felt like miles, though Daemon knew it could not be more than a few hundred feet. The air grew colder and drier, the sound of the storm faded to nothing, replaced by a deep silence that felt oppressive, expectant. Finally, the passage leveled out and began to run horizontal. Daemon found himself in a tunnel that seemed to have been used more recently. The dust was disturbed in places, there were marks on the walls that could have been made by shoulders brushing against stone. Someone had been using this passage, recently. Daemon extinguished his torch, not wanting to announce his presence, and continued forward using only the faint glow of the fungi for guidance. After another 100 yards, the tunnel opened into a larger space, and Daimon found himself at the edge of the catacombs he knew from childhood exploration, the vast network of burial chambers and bone repositories that underlie the castle's foundations. But this part of the catacombs was different from what he remembered. The walls were covered in symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood, and the air was thick with a scent that reminded him of burning hair and copper. In the center of the main chamber was a sunkhole, the same sunkhole Cassius had described in his journal, still visible despite 3 decades of dusty neglect. And standing at the edge of that sunkhole, as if she had been waiting for him, was Morgana. The queen looked exactly as she had 7 years ago when Daimon had last seen her, not a day older, her beauty cold, perfect, utterly inhuman. She wore a gown of deep crimson that seemed to mauve of its own accord, and her eyes, which had once been brown, now glowed with a faint silver light. She smiled when she saw him, but there was no warmth in it, only a predator's satisfaction at cornered prey. She spoke, her voice echoing strangely in the underground chamber. She told him that she had known he would come, had known from the moment Alfa sent him to Tornuel Manor that the king was testing him, seeing if his son would have the courage to seek the truth. She said that Alfa was not as bound by the ritual as Daimon thought, that the king had known for years what Morgana had done to him and had chosen to accept it, had chosen to remain emotionless because the alternative was too painful to bear. She told Daimon that his mother Elara had been weak, that her love had been a liability, and that by removing Alfa's capacity to feel, Morgana had created the greatest ruler the kingdom had ever known, a king who could make decisions based on logic and necessity rather than sentiment and compassion. She said that Cassius had been a fool, that his plan could never have worked, and that even if Daimon somehow managed to break the binding, all he would accomplish would be the destruction of his father and the destabilization of the realm. Daimon listened to all of this, his hand on the hilt of his sword, and then he asked her a single question. If Alfa had truly chosen this, if he truly accepted what had been done to him, then why had he sent Daimon to find the truth? Why not simply have Cassius executed quietly, all evidence destroyed? Why leave the journals intact, the passage open, the components accessible? Morgana's smile faltered for just a moment, and in that moment, Daimon saw something he had never expected to see in the queen's eyes: fear. She recovered quickly, her expression smoothing back into that mask of cold perfection, but the damage was done. Daimon understood. Alfa had not sent him to Tornuel Manor as a test of courage. He had sent him because some part of the king, some fragment of the man he had been before the ritual, was crying out for release, was desperate enough to risk everything on the chance that his son might be able to free him. Morgana moved to stop him as Daimon pulled out the dagger with the light-absorbing blade, but she was a fraction of a second too slow. Daimon had been trained by the finest sword masters in the realm, had survived 7 years of exile through skill and speed, and he moved now with the precision of someone who knew he had only one chance. He slashed his own palm with the dagger, letting his blood that carried Alfa's line and Elara's sacrifice, drip onto the ancient circle. The symbols on the walls began to glow, not with the cold light of Morgana's magic but with something warmer, something that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Morgana screamed, a sound that was more fury than pain, and lunged at him, her hands curled into claws that suddenly looked far less human than they should. But the circle was reacting now, responding to the blood of Alfa's air, an invisible barrier slammed into place between them. Daimon spoke the words Cassius had written in his letter, the words of the counter-ritual, and as he spoke them, the ground beneath his feet began to shake. The catacombs were waking up, were remembering what had been done, and they were responding. Dusty small stones rained from the ceiling, and the bones in the alcoves began to rattle in their niches. Morgana was shouting something, trying to counter his spell with one of her own, but her voice was being drowned out by a rising wind that seemed to be coming from the circle itself, a wind that carried with it the whispers of everyone who had been sacrificed to maintain the binding, everyone whose souls Morgana had trapped and used. Daemon heard his sister's voice among them, heard Lyanna calling his name, and he focused on that voice, used it to anchor himself as he poured more of his blood onto the circle and continued the ritual. The barriers between the catacombs and the castle above were tenured, and as the ritual reached its crescendo, Daemon felt the presence of others arriving, drawn by the massive magical discharge. He heard footsteps thundering down the stairs, heard shouted commands and the clash of weapons, and then the door to the catacombs burst open and the royal guard flooded in, with King Alfa himself at their head. The king looked haggard, older than Daimon remembered, and he was clutching his chest as if in pain, his face twisted in an expression that might have been agony or might have been something else entirely. Morgana turned away from Daemon to face her husband, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other, 3 decades of complex and twisted history passing between them in a single look. Then Alfa did something that no one, least of all Morgana, expected. He stepped into the circle, placing himself beside his son. The effect was immediately catastrophic. The binding, which had been designed to work on one person, suddenly found itself trying to encompass 2, each could not hold. The circle exploded with light, and everyone in the catacombs was thrown backward by the force of it. Daemon felt himself slam into a wall, felt ribs crack and his head impact stone, and then everything went dark for a period of time he could not measure. When he came to, the catacombs were in ruins, half the ceiling had collapsed, and the circle was gone, its symbols scoured from the floor as if they had never been. Morgana was on her knees, blood trickling from her nose and ears, her perfect beauty suddenly looking cracked and fragile. Rei Alfa was lying on the ground, unconscious but breathing, and the expression on his sleeping face was one of peace, the kind of peace that Daemon had never seen his father wear. The royal guard was picking itself up, some with injuries, others simply stunned. They looked to Daemon for explanation, and he realized with a start that he was now, technically, in command. The king was incapacitated, and Daemon was the only heir presenting conscious. He gave orders quickly, commanding that Alfa be taken to his chambers and attended by the court physicians, that Morgana be arrested and confined to her tower under guard, and that no one was to speak of what had happened until Alfa himself could explain. The guards obeyed, though Daemon could see confusion and fear in their eyes. Whatever had happened, it had been big enough that the entire castle had felt it, and rumors would already be spreading like wildfire through the corridors above. Daemon followed as they carried his father up from the catacombs, through passages he had not seen since childhood, and finally into the royal chambers where he himself had been born. The physicians arrived within minutes, examining Alfa with professional efficiency, and their pronouncement was cautiously optimistic. The king lived, his body was strong, but something fundamental had changed in him, something that would require time to fully understand. They recommended rest, isolation, and observation. Daemon agreed to all of it and stationed his most trusted guards outside the door before making his way to Morgana's tower. The queen had not resisted arrest, had allowed herself to be led away without a word, and Daemon found her now sitting in her private chambers, staring out the window at the city below. She looked diminished somehow, as if whatever power she had wielded was now draining away. He asked her why she had done it, why she had bound herself so completely to Alfa, and her answer was not what he expected. She told him that she had loved Elarato, that the healer had been her friend, perhaps her only friend, and when Malachai's assassins had struck, Morgana had tried to save both mother and child but had been too late. She had watched Elara die, had held her as the light faded from her eyes, and had made a promise in that moment that she would protect Elara esse child and ensure that those responsible paid for what they had done. The ritual had seemed like the perfect solution, a way to give Alpha the strength he needed to survive and rule while channeling his grief into productive vengeance. But Morgana had not fully understood what she was doing, had not realized that the ritual would bind them both, would trap her in a cycle of constantly feeding dark magic to maintain something that should never have been created in the first place. Daemon asked about the souls in the tower, about Lyanna and the others, and Morgana told him that they were not dead but transformed, existing in a state between life and death, their consciousness preserved but their bodies changed into vessels for magical energy. She said that with the binding now broken, they might be able to be released, to be restored to something resembling normal life, but each would require careful working team, and even then, there were no guarantees. Some of them had been trapped for so long that they might no longer remember how to be human. Daemon felt rage building in his chest again, wanted to strike her, to hurt her the way she had hurt so many, but he restrained himself. Violence would accomplish nothing now. What mattered was fixing what could be fixed and ensuring that nothing like this ever happened again. He left Morgana under guard and went to the tower's upper chamber, the sealed room that no one had entered without the queen's permission in decades. The door was no longer warded, the magical locks having failed when the binding broke, and each swung open at his touch. Inside was a sight that would haunt Daemon for the rest of his life. 7 crystal coffins arranged in a circle, each one containing a figure that glowed with the same silver light he had seen in Morgana's eyes. He recognized Lyanna immediately, his sister looking exactly as she had 7 years ago, frozen in time, her white hair spread around her head like a halo. The others he did not know by sight, but from Cassius's journal, he could guess who they were. The other children, the sacrificed relatives, all preserved in this terrible nibble. Daemon reached out, he touched Lyanna's coffin, and the crystal felt warm beneath his palm, pulsing with a heartbeat that should not exist. He spoke to her, told her that he was Eddie, that he was going to get her out, that he was going to make this right. Impossibly, incredibly, her eyes opened. They were still that unnatural silver, but there was recognition in them, awareness, and tears began to stream down her cheeks, somehow escaping the crystal that contained her. Daemon pressed both hands against the coffin and channeled every ounce of will he possessed into breaking it, and perhaps because the binding was broken, perhaps because Morgana's power was fading, or perhaps because sheer desperate love was its own kind of magic, the crystal began to crack. Lines of fraction spread across its surface like a spiderweb, and then with a sound like breaking ice, the entire thing shattered. Lyanna fell forward into his arms, gasping and shaking, her body suddenly feeling the weight of gravity and air, a sensation after 7 years of suspension. She was freezing cold, her skin like marble, but she was alive, truly alive, and as Daemon held her and felt her heartbeat strengthen, he found himself weeping for the first time since childhood. She clung to him with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his shoulders, and when she finally found her voice, it was hoarse and broken but undeniably hers. She asked him if it was really over, if Morgana's ritual was truly broken, and when he confirmed that it was, she began to laugh through her tears, a sound that was equal parts joy and hysteria. Daemon held her until the shaking subsided, then carefully helped her to sit on the floor while he examined the other coffins. If Lyanna could be freed, then perhaps the others could be as well. He worked systematically, moving from coffin to coffin, placing his hands on each one and willing each to break. Some responded more easily than others, and he quickly realized that the length of imprisonment mattered. The ones who had been trapped for only a few years shattered relatively quickly. The ones who had been in it for decades required more effort, more focus, more of whatever energy he was channeling. By the time he had freed the 70th now prisoner, one of Alpha's brothers who had supposedly died of plague 28 years ago. Daimon was exhausted, his hands bleeding from crystal cuts, his head pounding with strain. But they were all alive, all breathing, all staring at him with expressions that ranged from gratitude till confusion till deep, abiding terror. Diana had recovered enough to stand, though she leaned heavily on the wall for support, and she helped Daimon guide the others out of the tower and down to chambers where they could be properly cared for. The castle staff, already a state of near panic from the magical discharge and the rumors spreading like a plague, took this new development with admirable professionalism, finding rooms, bringing food and watery blankets, summoning healers who could at least attempt to address the physical effects of prolonged magical stasis. Daimon left the newly freed prisoners in their care and returned to his father's chambers, where he was told that the king had still not awakened but seemed to be resting peacefully, his vital signs strong and stable. Daimon sat in a chair beside the bed and studied his father's face, really looked at it for the first time in years. Without the cold mask of emotionless authority, Alpha looked different, younger perhaps, or maybe just more human. The lines around his eyes spoke of strain rather than cruelty, and there was a vulnerability in his sleeping expression that Daimon had never associated with the man who had ruled the kingdom with an iron fist for 3 decades. He found himself wondering what his father would be like when he woke, whether the man who had loved the latter would return, or whether 30 years of living without emotions would have damaged him beyond repair. There were stories of people who had suffered severe trauma and lost their ability to feel, who had spent years in that numb state and then, when recovery came, found themselves unable to integrate the two halves of their existence, the fili and the not fili, and had ultimately shattered under the weight of it. Night fell, and Daimon remained at his father's bedside, dismissing offers of food or rest. The castle had settled into an uneasy quiet, guards posted at every corner, servants whispering in clusters, members of the court hovering in corridors waiting for news. Daimon knew he would have to address them eventually, would have to make some kind of official statement, but he could not bring himself to leave before Alpha woke. He owed his father that much at least, to be there when the king opened his eyes and found himself in a world fundamentally different from the one he had known for 30 years. It was near midnight when Alpha finally stirred, his breathing changing from the deep rhythm of sleep to something more conscious. His eyelids fluttered, his hands clenched and clenched on the blankets, and then his eyes opened, and Daimon found himself looking into orbs that were no longer the cold gray he remembered but a warm hazel brown. Alpha looked at him for a long moment, confusion evident in his expression, and then tears began to stream down the king's face, silent and uncontrolled. Daimon reached out instinctively, taking his father's hand, and Alpha gripped it with desperate strength, his whole body beginning to shake with sobs that came from somewhere so deep they seemed to tear something vital with each exhalation. Daimon had never seen his father cry, had never seen him display any emotion beyond cold anger or colder satisfaction, and the raw vulnerability of this moment was almost unbearable to witness. But he held on, maintained the physical connection, and gradually the sobbing subsided into ragged breathing, Alpha's grip loosened slightly. The king's first words were not what Daimon expected. Alpha asked about Morgana, whether she was still alive, and when Daimon confirmed that she was alive and imprisoned in her tower, Alpha closed his eyes and nodded. He said that she needed to be protected, that whatever she had done out of love and loss, and that he would not see her executed or exiled. Daimon felt a flash of anger at that, wanted to argue that Morgana deserved punishment for the decades of manipulation in the soul she had trapped, but he beat back the words when he saw the expression on his father's face. Alpha was not defending Morgana out of continued binding or residual control. He was defending her because he understood her, because he had spent 30 years as the beneficiary and victim of her terrible attempt to help him, and he knew that her crimes had been born not from malice but from grief as profound as his own. Alfa asked about the others, about the people who had been trapped in the tower, and Daimon told him everything about Liana and the 6 others, about freeing them, about their current condition. Alfa's face crumpled again at the news that his daughter lived, and he asked if she would see him, if she could bear to be in the same room as the father who had ordered her execution. Daimon said he did not know but that he would ask, and Alfa nodded, accepting that uncertain answer with a humility that was completely foreign to the more Daimon had known. The king asked what had happened in the catacombs, and Daimon explained about finding Cassius' journals, about learning the truth of his birth and his mother's death, about the ritual and the counter-ritual in the moment when Alfa himself had stepped into the circle. The king listened to all of this, his face passing through a dozen different expressions, grief, anger, and regret, and something that might have been gratitude. When Daimon finished, Alfa was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said that he remembered everything, every decision he had made without the burden of conscience, every order he had given without feeling the weight of its cruelty, and the memories were like knives cutting into him now that he could feel again. He said that he had known, on some level, what Morgana had done to him, had chosen to accept it because the alternative was drowning in grief so intense that it would have destroyed him. But over the years, the binding had become a prison of its own, and he had found himself longing for release even as he feared what that release would bring. Alfa told his son about the night of Daimon's birth, about holding Elara as she died, about feeling her life force transfer into the infant she had just delivered, about the rage and helplessness that had consumed him in the hours afterward. He said that when Morgana had offered him a way to become strong enough to avenge Elara and protect their son, he had taken it without fully understanding the cost. He had thought the ritual would just remove his grief, his pain, his vulnerability. He had not realized it would remove everything, all capacity for loving joy and connection, leaving him as an empty shell that could rule but could not live. And once the ritual was complete, once he had become that shell, he had lacked the emotional capacity to regret his choice or seek to reverse it, locked in a paradox of his own creation. Daimon asked why Alfa had sent him to Tornuel Manor if he had known what was there, and the king's answer was complex. He said that there had been moments, brief flickers, when the binding would weaken slightly, usually when he was forced to make decisions regarding his children. In those moments, some fragment of his original self would surface, would scream at him to stop, to change course, to remember what it meant to be human. The order to execute Liana had been one of those moments, and when Daimon had refused and Morgana had suggested exile instead, Alfa had felt something that might have been relief, though he had not recognized it as such at the time. Over the subsequent years, those flickers had become slightly more frequent, and he had begun to realize that he was not as completely bound as Morgana believed, that some part of him was fighting back. When Cassius had been arrested and his conspiracy discovered, Alfa had wanted to have him quietly killed and all evidence destroyed, but the fragment of original self had intervened, had argued that perhaps the conspiracy was exactly what was needed, that perhaps Daimon deserved to know the truth he have. The choice his father had never been given. So Alfa had staged the public execution, had made a show of Cassius' death, but had left the manor intact, had left the journals and the components and the map. He had sent his son to investigate alone, gambling everything on the possibility that Daimon would be brave enough and clever enough to see the path forward. It had been the most human decision Alfa had made in 30 years, and it had been agony to make it, fighting against the binding as a compulsion to eliminate all threats and maintain the status quo. Daimon sat back in his chair, Processing all of this, he found himself looking at his father with new eyes. Alfa was not the monster he had seemed, nor was he simply a victim. He was a man who had made a terrible choice in a moment of unbearable pain, who had lived with the consequences of the choice for decades, and who had ultimately found the courage to risk everything for the chance at redemption. That did not excuse the atrocities committed during those decades, did not erase the pain inflicted on countless innocent people, but each provided context. Context was something Daimon desperately needed if he was going to help his father navigate what came next. Because what came next was going to be extraordinarily difficult. The kingdom had been ruled for 30 years by a king whose every decision was made without emotional consideration, and suddenly the king was fully human again, capable of feeling the weight of his actions. The transition was going to be traumatic for everyone involved. Alfa seemed to be thinking along the same lines because he asked Daimon what he should do, how he should govern now that he could feel again. Daimon had no easy answer for that. He said that the first step had to be addressing the court in the kingdom, being honest about what had happened and what each meant going forward. There would be those who would see the revelation as weakness, who would move to exploit each or challenge Alfa's right to rule. There would be those who would be horrified by the truth of the binding and demand justice or retribution. There would be those who would simply be confused and frightened by the sudden change in their monarch's demeanor. All of these reactions would need to be managed carefully if they wanted to avoid civil war or worse. Alfa agreed but said that before any public announcement, he needed to see Lyanna, needed to beg his daughter's forgiveness even knowing he might never receive it. Daimon left his father's chamber and went to find his sister, who had been given a room in the east wing and was currently being attended by healers trying to reverse the physical effects of her transformation. She was still pale, still had the unnatural white hair, but the silver glow in her eyes had faded to something closer to normal, and she was sitting up in bed, eating soup and looking more alive than she had in the tower. When Daimon told her that Alfa wanted to see her, her expression went through several rapid changes before settling into something that might have been resignation or might have been curiosity. She agreed to admit but insisted that Daimon remain present, and he understood why. Whatever Alfa had become, he was still the man who had ordered her death, and Lyanna had every right to be wary of him. They made their way back to the royal chambers, Lyanna leaning on Daimon for support, her steps uncertain after 7 years of stasis. Alfa was sitting up in bed when they entered, and when he saw his daughter, his face crumpled with an emotion so raw it was painful to witness. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but words failed him, and he simply wept, open and unashamed, while Lyanna stood in the doorway and watched. Finally, she moved forward, approaching the bed with cautious steps, and when she was close enough, she reached out and took her father's hand. She did not say that she forgave him, did not offer words of comfort or absolution, but the gesture itself was enough. Alfa clung to her hand like a drowning man to a lifeline, and for a long time, they simply sat there, father and daughter, connected by touch if not yet by trust. Eventually, Lyanna began to speak, telling Alfa about her time in the tower, about what each had been like to be trapped between life and death, aware but unable to act, watching years pass through the crystal walls of her prison. She said that she had been angry at first, had raged against the injustice of each, but over time the anger had faded into something closer to numbness, and she had begun to wonder if she would spend eternity in that state, conscious but disconnected from everything that made existence meaningful. Alfa listened to every word, his face showing the full weight of his guilt, and when she finished, he told her that he understood if she could never forgive him, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends and knowing each would never be enough. Lyanna considered this for a moment, then said that forgiveness was not something she could offer immediately, that trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, one day at a time, but that she was willing to try if he was. Alfa nodded, accepting those terms without argument. Daimon felt something ease his chest, a tension he had been carrying since the moment he had opened Cassius's first journal. His family was broken, perhaps irreparably, but at least they were all alive and had the chance to attempt healing. Over the next 3 days, preparations were made for Alfa's duel de court in the kingdom. The king met with each of the freed prisoners individually, offering apologies that felt inadequate even as they were necessary. Some accepted his words with varying degrees of grace. Others refused to see him at all. Alfa accepted those rejections as the just consequences of his actions. He met with Morgana as well, a private conversation that lasted several hours and from which both emerged looking emotionally devastated. Daimon was not privy to what was said between them, but afterward, Morgana agreed to remain in supervised confinement and to help however she could with the transition, using her magical knowledge to assist in fully healing those who had been trapped in the tower. The day of the address arrived, and the throne room was packed with nobles, officials, representatives from every major house and faction in the kingdom. Daimon stood at his father's right hand, Liana at his left, both of them there as symbols of what had been lost and what had been found. Alfa looked older than he had 3 days ago, the weight of returned emotion aging in ways the binding never had, but there was a strength in him too, a cord of determination that had nothing to do with magical compulsion, everything to do with human will. He began to speak, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. He told them everything. He told them about Elara, about her death and his grief. He told them about Morgana's ritual and the binding that had ruled him for 30 years. He told them about Cassius's conspiracy and Daimon's discovery. He told them about the breaking of the binding and what each meant going forward. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some nobles were outraged, demanding that both Alfa and Morgana be tried for crimes against the realm. Others were sympathetic, seeing the tragedy in what had happened and willing to give their king a chance to prove himself under his new circumstances. Still others were calculating, already considering how this revelation might be used to advance their own positions. Daimon had expected all of this, but what he had not expected was the third reaction, from a younger baron who stood and asked a question that silenced the entire room. The baron wanted to know if Alfa, now that he could feel, could bear the weight of the decisions he had made. Could he live with the memories of executions ordered without remorse, of laws enforced without mercy, if policies that had crushed the weak for the benefit of the strong? If he could not, what did that mean for the stability of the kingdom? Alfa did not flinch from the question. He said that he did not know if he could bear that weight, that there were moments already when the memories threatened to overwhelm him, but that he had to try because the alternative was abandoning his responsibility and leaving the kingdom vulnerable. He said that he had been a monster for 30 years, but he had also been an effective ruler in many ways, and he hoped that by combining the wisdom gained from 3 decades of cold calculation with the empathy and conscience he had regained, he might become something better than either version of himself had been separately. Each was an honest answer, perhaps too honest for some of the nobles, but each was what they needed to hear. A king who could acknowledge his own failures and uncertainties was, in its own way, more trustworthy than one who claimed infallibility. The session continued for hours, with questions and debates and arguments flying back and forth across the throne room. Daimon participated where appropriate, supporting his father's decisions but also making it clear that he would be watching, that the days of unquestioned authority were over, and that Alfa would be held accountable for his actions going forward. By the time the gathering finally dispersed, a tentative consensus had been reached. Alfa would remain king, but a council would be formed, composed of representatives from various factions, to advise him and provide checks on his power. Morgana would remain confined but would not be executed, her expertise too valuable to waste. The freed prisoners would be given positions and support to help them reintegrate into society, a public acknowledgement of the injustices they had suffered. In the days that followed, the kingdom slowly adjusted to its new reality. There were challenges, conflicts between those who supported the changes and those who resisted them, but gradually a new order began to emerge. Alfa proved himself capable of ruling with empathy as well as logic, making decisions that took into account the human cost of policies in ways he never had before. Liana, despite her initial reluctance, became one of his most trusted advisors, her own experience with suffering giving her a perspective that balanced his. Daemon found himself in the unexpected olive bridge between the old order and the new, respected by both sides and trusted to navigate the complex politics of transition. Morgana, though, found a new purpose. From her confinement in the tower, she worked tirelessly to develop methods of healing the magical damage she had inflicted, not just on those she had trapped but on others throughout the kingdom who had suffered from various curses and bindings. It was not redemption, not exactly, but it was a start, a way of using her considerable power for construction rather than destruction. She and Alfa met regularly, conversations that remained private but that seemed to bring both of them a measure of peace. Daemon suspected that they were, in their own way, healing each other, two people bound together by shared trauma finding a way to move forward without forgetting what had been. 6 months after the breaking of the binding, Daemon stood on the battlements of the castle, looking out over the city as the sun set. He thought about everything that had changed, about the father he was slowly getting to know, about the sister he had thought lost forever, about the kingdom that was struggling to redefine itself. He thought about Cassius, whose sacrifice had made all of this possible. He wondered if the old advisor would be satisfied with what had come from his conspiracy. And he thought about his mother, Elara, the woman he had never known but whose love had shaped everything, whose final act had saved his life and set in motion events that would not resolve for 30 years. Behind him, he heard footsteps. He turned to find Alfa approaching. His father looked tired but more at peace than Daemon could remember ever seeing him. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights begin to appear in the city below, and then Alfa spoke. He said that he had been thinking about abdication, about whether it would be better for the kingdom if he stepped aside and let someone else, someone without his history, take the throne. Daemon asked what had stopped him, and Alfa smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. He said that Liana had talked him out of it, had pointed out that running from responsibility was not the same as taking accountability, and that the kingdom needed a leader who understood both the cost of emotionless rule and the necessity of compassionate governance. Daemon found himself smiling too, recognizing his sister's wisdom in those words. He told his father that he thought it was the right decision, that for all the pain of the past, Alfa had an opportunity now to create a legacy that was about more than just efficient brutality. He could build something better, something that honored Elara's memory by embodying the values she had died protecting. Alfa nodded, his eyes distant, and said that he hoped he was strong enough for the task, that the weight of his memories would not crush him before he could accomplish something meaningful. Daemon reached out and gripped his father's shoulder, a gesture of support and solidarity. He told him that he would not be alone in that work, that they would all carry the weight together, as a family should. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, father and son stood together on the battlements, looking toward a future that was uncertain but, for the first time in decades, held the possibility of genuine hope. The kingdom had been built on secrets and lies, on power obtained through sacrifice and maintained through cruelty, but perhaps now each could be rebuilt on truth and accountability, on the acknowledgement of past sins and the commitment to do better going forward. It would not be easy, there would be setbacks and struggles, But they had something now that they had not had before. They had the truth, painful and complete, and the truth was the foundation for everything that came next. The reign of the emotionless king was over, and the reign of the healing king had begun, and whatever the future held, they would face it together, as the broken family they were, working toward becoming the family they needed to be.